We continue our investigation of the relationship between religion and science in part two. And just as a quick review, we talked about the idea that religion and science conflict with one another, or the view that they are completely independent from one another in part one. So in part two, we're going to look at the possibility that there is a dialogue between the two endeavors, and or the fourth position then, that there is an integration. The two ought to and are integrated with one another. So let's explore the idea of dialogue. The idea here is that science and religion can learn from one another through dialogue. They can inform the way that science is done, for example, from the religious perspective, and science can inform religion about the world that God created, say, for example. Now, instead of going through four different positions in the area of dialogue, I want to just make four different points on the topic of dialogue. One is that there are metaphysical presuppositions of science that might be influenced by religious belief. So when people conduct scientific activity, they may be influenced by their religious belief. And in fact, that's the way it's been in the past. And at some points in history, religion was extremely influential for one's approach to science. That's the case with Isaac Newton, for example. So there might be presuppositions. If one believes that God created the universe, then one believes that nature is intelligible. It's something that we can understand. It was created by an intelligent being. There's a rational order to things. And the order of the world is contingent. It didn't have to be this way. Creation was done freely, and so we have to investigate how the world is. And nature has value. Nature is good and has value in itself, since the acts of a creator are good. And then finally, nature is uniform, because God is the creator of all of the universe. And so every part of the universe is going to follow, for example, the same physical laws. So these are assumptions, or maybe presumptions, that are brought to science from a religious perspective, and then inform the way that science is conducted. So the doctrine of creation, as we've just mentioned, has been very influential in the formation of many of the presuppositions of science. And those presuppositions we just mentioned are not the result of science, but they're foundational for doing science. They are preludes to a scientific method and investigation. Now, religious theses were vastly influential when initiating the very scientific revolution where we get to the science, the methods, and so on that we use today, and the turn away from the Aristotelian methods, which were still common in the medieval era. And the Aristotelian methods had this idea that you could kind of deduce the way that things are conceptually, instead of the contemporary view that you would have to go out and investigate how things are, and you couldn't just deduce it directly from concepts. Another aspect of dialogue is the determination of boundaries. So this is, again, these are not positions, various positions people held, but they are different aspects of the approach of dialogue with science and religion conversing, so to speak, with one another. So there would be boundaries still in between science and religion. In some places there may be a lack of boundaries. Science, for example, has boundaries that prompt metaphysical questions or religious questions, and certainly philosophical and ethical questions, like what initiated the Big Bang? Some of the why questions. Why are the laws of nature as they in fact are? Why are they that way? Why is there something rather than nothing? A philosophical question, right? what's the proper use of various technologies? Certainly a philosophical, moral kind of question. So science can develop nuclear weapons, but it takes philosophy to think through when or if we should use those nuclear weapons. The same with atomic power in general, with genetic engineering, mapping the human genome and what we do with that knowledge. These are questions for ethicists. Ernan McMullen is an example of someone who takes the view of dialogue, although I don't think he fits perfectly neatly into this category. But they emphasize what religion can learn from science, and certainly McMullen warns against a God of the gap mentality when you're evaluating science and doing science. So if there are questions that remain unanswered after conducting scientific research, McMullen says we shouldn't try to plug in God to solve those questions, that's not the best way to approach science. McMullen claims instead that science and religion function on two different planes of explanation, right? So they're working in two different realms, so to speak, even though they can interact with one another. They're more consistent than is often thought because of that. A third point to bring up with the idea of dialogue is that there are methodological parallels between religion and science. And so typically people presuppose that the methodologies of these two are completely different, but some people have emphasized the subjective aspect of science. For example, Thomas Kuhn, an extremely influential philosopher of science, did that, or the objective aspects of religion, for example. And some recent philosophers of science have really emphasized this idea that science is much more subjective than we previously thought. Human observations, human presuppositions of the scientists themselves influence how they do science. And so philosophers of science have become very good at pointing out how this happens. And in fact, scientists themselves have recognized that quantum theory emphasizes this fact that our observation of something may actually change the object being observed. And so you have to be aware of the human interaction with the scientific project. Other methodological parallels that might be raised, science is certainly a social endeavor, and as such, there are going to be political pressures, there are going to be power struggles similar to religions. If you've ever been to a department meeting in a physics or chemistry department, you will see this certainly when it comes to resources that are always limited and what direction the department should go. And that's also done on a much larger, grander scale when we're conducting science. One might also view the progression of science as paradigm shifts, as Kuhn describes them, or as Lakatos describes them as changes in research programs. And similar changes might occur in religion. So we have, for example, the Reformation and you know, these great shifts in how we conduct religious endeavors. Now, another aspect that religion and science share is the use of models to gain insight into the world. So certainly in science, models are intended to represent an aspect of reality that's beyond our observational capacity. So we model atoms, we model molecules, we make mathematical models, we do this in all kinds of areas of science, and religion has a similar process with metaphor, and the use of metaphor to get at the religious truths that are trying to be communicated. Finally, we're still in the area of dialogue. Resistance often comes from internal sources not external sources. So this is common between both religion and science. And historically, there's often been as much resistance to scientific advances from within the scientific community. People often think that religion has tried to hold back science, but that's not often the case, as we'll see here in a little bit. That's actually less often the case, typically, than resistance from within the scientific community itself. This has happened when evolutionary theory, when the theory of relativity, when the Copernican theory was brought forward. Yes, there were some concerns from religion in all of those cases, but there were also concerns within the scientific community. An example of this with the politics would be the discovery of the double helix of the DNA, that structure. It was as much of a political achievement within the scientific community as it was a scientific achievement for Crick and Watson, who were clearly fighting against, racing against other teams and other research projects that were also on the same path that they were. And there was some political maneuvering, and there are interesting stories about what went on during that time when we were trying to get a better grip on DNA and how it was structured. And then finally, the fourth approach, the fourth view on the relationship between religion and science is that of integration. And the idea here is that in order to have a unified, a comprehensive understanding of the universe, of reality, some think that we have to move beyond dialogue and then integrate, for example, the methods of religion and science, integrate the two in other ways. And I'll talk about three different ways that people have done this. One is through natural theology. So this is something that people who do philosophy of religion are very familiar with. The methods of Thomas Aquinas, for example, in the teleological argument. The contemporary design argument is one that's using the investigations of science and physics and astronomy to create an argument for the existence of God. So those are integrated together. The aims and the methods of science and religion might still be distinct. Certainly, you don't have to do labs when you are doing philosophy, other than, there are thought experiments, we do those, but we don't need lab equipment for it, right? The object of what they're investigating might overlap, even though the methods are different. The use of functional concepts in science and maybe even the use of design concepts might be beneficial for biology as well as other disciplines. Some people have argued in this way, both from the scientific side and from the religious side. Another approach or way that people have talked about integration between the two is a theology of nature. Now here, the idea is that we use scientific resources to reinterpret or maybe revise theological doctrines. So science kind of takes a precedence here, and then it's used to think about how we should view traditional theological doctrines. There are process theologians, Alfred North Whitehead was one example, who endorsed a systematic synthesis between the two. And the goal there is to produce a comprehensive metaphysical system. So, for example, with the prominence of evolution, Whitehead emphasized becoming, right? The changing, the development over being, something that might be static or permanent. And activity then is going to be emphasized over just what is the case. And so the two are integrated together in that way. Okay, so what are the trends? We've talked about conflict and independence, as well as dialogue and integration. There seems to be an increasing trend recently away from the view of conflict and independence and toward that of dialogue and integration. And the trend is actually somewhat of a return to how science developed in the first place. Dialogue and integration was crucial to the infancy of modern science, to getting modern science off the ground. Religious institutions were the centers of scientific advances initially. And in a way, you might say this is back to the future, this trend toward this, maybe back to the past. There's that integration between the two, but the concept of a university certainly grew from monasteries, from religious training centers, and the church in a variety of forms provided planning, development, finances, the organization for universities and research facilities that then served as a foundation for modern science. And that's certainly the case continuing into today. So many great academic institutions were created by religious organizations. Just to name a few here, there, Harvard, for example, the fantastic University of Notre Dame, Yale, Vanderbilt, Baylor, Princeton, USC, SMU, Boston College, Cambridge, Oxford, University of Paris, and I could go on for another 5 minutes. You see these highly reputable academic institutions today that wouldn't exist were it not for the religious organizations that initiated them. And we have that, certainly that integration between religion and science. Of course, some of these institutions have kind of shed or downplayed their religious origin, but others, like Baylor and Notre Dame, certainly have not. And that's an important part of the university to this day.